to talk about the environmental risk factors for schizophrenia, but of course, one can only consider the environmental risk factors in the context of the importance of genetic risk, because we know that genetic risk is the most important risk for schizophrenia. So we have to think, how do the environmental factors correlate or interact with the genetic factors? And as you will know, there has been a dramatic breakthrough in the understanding of the genetics of schizophrenia through a large collaborative study, and you will hear more tomorrow from Nick Craddock about this, but this is 36,000 cases of schizophrenia compared with 113,000 healthy controls, and a genome-wide association study carried out on data from all over the world, including, for example, from Verona in Italy. And the result published in Nature was that there are 108 loci significantly associated with schizophrenia. Now, being a psychiatric geneticist has been a very depressing experience. They either get silly results that nobody can replicate, or else they fail to find anything. The better ones generally fail to find anything. But at last, through this huge collaboration, there is a big finding of all these tiny little genes which add up to give the genetic contribution to schizophrenia. And I was at the conference in Hamburg where this was first announced. The audience of geneticists were so pleased that they stood up in the middle of the presentation and cheered. After all these depressing years, a big event. And as you can see here, not only in the conference, but also out in the street. In Scotland, for example, people are shouting 108 loci for schizophrenia. Hurrah, hurrah. This is important. Perhaps the most important study in schizophrenia in the last 10 years. And amongst the loci which are implicated is the dopamine DRD2 receptor. So we are all giving antipsychotics to block this receptor. So it's interesting, it's one of the genes which comes out as associated with schizophrenia. And also various glutamate genes. And we know that glutamate is involved in the control of dopamine synthesis and dopamine release. And also neurodevelopmental genes. And we've known for a long time that impaired neurodevelopment is involved in schizophrenia as well. So we have learned a lot about some of the genes which are involved in schizophrenia. And so we have to think that there is a developmental pathway. Actually, we saw this slide in the last presentation, excellent presentation, and people with schizophrenia, a proportion of them have developmental problems in cognitive or social deficits. They have anxiety and depression as they go into adolescence, and they develop quasi-psychotic ideas just before they break down in the prodrome. So we now know that there are many small neurodevelopmental genes involved in deviating the path of neurodevelopment. And there are also a small number of bigger copy number variants. And these are either deletions or duplications which impair neurodevelopment. So there are these genetic factors, but there are also environmental factors early on, pre- and perinatal complications, which increase the risk, often compounding the genetic impairment of neurodevelopment. So we know there's this developmental cascade towards schizophrenia, which ends up with rather eccentric, odd adolescents, but they are not psychotic. What turns them into psychotic individuals is the dopaminergic abnormality. And we know that the final common pathway to psychosis is dysregulation of the dopamine system. And that we have the striatal dopamine neuron, which in schizophrenia produces too much dopamine and releases too much dopamine, and this hits the DRD2 receptor. We spend all our time trying to block the blue receptors there. But the problem is mostly in the increased capacity to produce the dopamine, which in people with psychosis is greater than in the rest of us. One of the questions has been, when does the dopaminergic abnormality arise? And my colleague Oliver Howes has been looking at this using PET scans and a standard PET technique using fluorodopa uptake. And if you give this radio-labeled fluorodopa, it is concentrated in the striatum. And we can see that if you compare controls in blue, healthy controls, with people with psychosis who are in red, you can see that the people with psychosis have too much dopamine. They are synthesizing and releasing too much dopamine. But in the middle there, in yellow, are those people in the prodrome with the so-called at-risk mental state, popularized by Pat McGorry, the ARMS. And you can see that these individuals with ARMS, they are not yet frankly psychotic, but maybe 1/5 to 1/3 of them will develop psychosis. They have some fleeting, perhaps they think they might hear voices, or they are a little paranoid, but they're not frankly psychotic. But when you study their dopamine in the striatum, you find it is midway between the normal controls and the psychotic individuals. And not only that, but when you look at the individuals with the at-risk mental state, it is the ones with the highest dopamine who go on to develop psychosis. So you can see the 3 bars here, the healthy comparison group, the people from the prodrome, the at-risk mental state, who don't develop psychosis and their dopamine is not raised, and then the people who transit to become psychotic, their striatal dopamine is already raised. And as they become psychotic, it increases further. So we know that what precedes the onset of the psychosis is the increase in striatal dopamine. So it's the dopamine dysregulation which causes the abnormal salience, which makes the perceptual abnormalities and the thought disorder which characterizes a psychosis. So we know there is this developmental route into psychosis, but we also know that drug abuse can increase the risk of psychosis and of schizophrenia in particular. And we've known this for 60 years, since amphetamine psychosis was first presented. And in these days, we thought amphetamine psychosis was a phenocopy of schizophrenia. But now we know that schizophrenia is not a disease, it is merely a syndrome which can be caused by a range of factors, including drug abuse. Then this is just another route into psychosis. You can develop psychosis because you have developmental abnormalities, or you can develop psychosis and schizophrenia because you abuse drugs. Amphetamine psychosis is not so common, but methamphetamine psychosis has become very common in Japan, Taiwan, Australia, South Africa, California. Fortunately, not yet in Europe to a great extent. But a more common drug used in Europe is cannabis. And this shows the frequency of the use of cannabis amongst students under 17 across Europe. And you can see that the highest rates are in Switzerland and France, and moderate rates in the UK and in Italy. The UK rates are falling. The Italian rates are rising, I'm afraid to say. And of course, the vast majority of people who use cannabis have no problems with it. It's rather like alcohol. Most people who drink alcohol have no problems, but a small proportion will become dependent and will develop problems. Similarly, with cannabis, a small proportion of people will become dependent and a proportion will go on to develop psychosis. And there have now been 9 cohort studies, prospective cohort studies, examining the general population, dividing the population into those who use cannabis and those who don't use cannabis, and following them up to see who develops psychosis. And the largest and longest studies of these is the Swedish Army study of Andreas and colleagues, and they have studied 50,000 young men who were conscripted into the Swedish Army, and they were interviewed about their drug use, and those who were taking cannabis were 3 times more likely to go psychotic over the next, or to develop schizophrenia over the next 25 years than those who didn't use cannabis. And as I say, there have now been 8 other replications of this. Now, you know that psychiatric epidemiology is not an exact science. In fact, it's very unusual for all the studies of a particular question to come to the same result. But for cannabis, every good study that has prospectively looked at the relationship between cannabis use and psychosis has found that cannabis use increases the risk of psychosis. This is not because the cannabis users are also using other drugs. This is controlled for in some of these studies, and also abnormal personality controlled for as well. It does seem to be consistent, although a modest increase. And this is our study. We were invited to be part of the Dunedin study in New Zealand, and where about 1,000 children had been followed up since birth, have now been followed up to age 42. But this was carried out when they were 26, and they had been asked about their cannabis use when they were 14, or 15 rather, and then when they were 18. And you can see in the pink that if you started using cannabis when you were 18, you were only slightly more likely to be psychotic by age 26. That was not significant. But if you started using cannabis by 15, you were 4.5 times more likely to be psychotic by the time you were 26. And this study goes along with other studies which suggest that the earlier you start using cannabis, the greater your risk. There is, of course, a change in cannabis. I'm looking around at the average age of people here, and many of people of my generation and a little younger will have used old-fashioned weed or hash, which has a THC concentration of about 4%, tetrahydrocannabinol concentration of about 4%. But nowadays, much more potent cannabis is produced not in Afghanistan or Morocco, but particularly in Holland and England. And it is produced in houses which are converted to use a heat and light and hydroponic growing. So you produce a high potency cannabis. So this is the potency of cannabis in England in THC or tetrahydrocannabinol content. So this is old-fashioned resin or hash, which used to come from Morocco. The THC content around about 4 or 5%. Here is imported herbal cannabis, sometimes called marijuana or weed, And the THC content has increased a bit to about 9% in England. But the big difference is in sinsemilla or skunk. And this is the result of the hydroponic produce, and the THC content is about 16 to 18%. This is beginning to become more common in Italy, but not yet as common as in Holland or in the UK. In the UK, it has had a dramatic effect on psychosis. So this, for example, is a study one of our studies. The first author is Marta De Forti. You can see it was published in the Lancet Psychiatry 1 week ago, and it caused quite a lot of media interest because it suggested that a high proportion of schizophrenia results from the use of cannabis. But before getting to show you that, you should look at the author list. If you look at the author list, you will see that 12 of the authors are Italian. So this is an Italian English study on an English population, but with many Italian researchers. And you'll see that the population attributable fraction for high-potency cannabis was 24%. So 24% of cases of first episode psychosis in South London are attributable to the use of high-potency cannabis. That is to say, if nobody smoked the high-potency cannabis, which we call skunk, then there would be nearly 1/4 fewer cases of psychosis in South London. So this would be a huge effect if we could persuade people not to smoke this high-potency cannabis. And the reason is that the risk is much higher for the high-potency cannabis. Again, this is Marta De Forti's work, and you can see on the left-hand side of the slide the reference population, those who never use cannabis, and then you can see those who use old-fashioned hash. And actually, it almost looked as if it was protective. It was not significant. But at the right-hand side of the slide, you can see if you used high-potency cannabis, occasionally you doubled your risk. If you used it every weekend, you trebled your risk. And if you used high-potency cannabis every day, you were 5 times more likely to go psychotic than you were if you didn't use cannabis. So this is a very big effect, and of course it's important from a public health point of view. It's called skunk in Britain because it has a strong smell, like the little animal, the skunk. I don't know the Italian, I'm sorry. What we call this little animal, puzzula. We call this animal the skunk, which is a very strong smell like high-potency cannabis. But of course, even those adolescents who use puzzula and every day, only a small proportion of them develop psychosis. So the question is why? And it seems that there are certain genes involved in making you more susceptible. So if you use cannabis and you have certain genes, well, first of all, there was a very widely publicized study with Avshalom Caspi that suggested that COMT might make some individuals more prone. This has not been consistently replicated, so we don't know whether this is true or not. But certainly AKT1, which is a gene post the D2 receptor, so it's a postsynaptic involvement in the dopamine pathway, and the DRD2 receptor. These two genes seem to increase the susceptibility to cannabis-induced psychosis. So we can think that there's a developmental route into psychosis, but there's also a drug route to psychosis. And the people who develop psychosis following drug abuse are often much more socially and intellectually competent than the neurodevelopmentally impaired people that we otherwise see with psychosis. So these are smart kids, sociable kids, who are able to get cannabis when they're 13 or 14 and also get the money without being found out in order to use a lot of cannabis. Finally, What about social factors? This is a big epidemiological study in the UK across 3 different centres in Bristol, Southeast London, and Nottingham. And we had cases and we had controls, and we were able to see what increased the risk, what risk factors there were. And the risk factors were migration. So, for example, all migrants into the UK, white migrants, for example, Italian migrants, Finnish, French, were twice as likely to develop psychosis, but black migrants were about 6 times more likely to develop psychosis, and lots of studies have shown this as well. We showed that childhood adversity also increased the risk, including childhood abuse. Lots of studies have also shown this, and we showed that acute stress, acute life events also increased the risk. So social factors also increase the risk of psychosis. But an interesting fact is that the incidence of psychosis varies very widely. And now there are standardized ways of looking at the incidence. And for example, the ESOP study, which I just mentioned, has been copied, and people have used similar methodology in different centres. And here you can see that in London, the incidence of psychosis was 51 per 100,000 per year. Now, in Bologna, Ilaria Tarraconi and colleagues have done a similar study, and they found in Bologna the incidence was only 16 per 100,000. And Bologna has a very good case register, and I don't believe that, I think they probably missed fewer cases than we missed in London, and yet the incidence was much lower. And in Veneto, Antonia La Salvia and colleagues actually from Verona, I'm afraid I don't have a picture of Antonio, and I don't have a picture of Verona. I only have a picture of Venice. So you'll have to imagine this is Antonia who is maneuvering the gondola here. So again, the incidence was low at 18 per 100,000. We've also done a study in Brazil, in the huge city of Sao Paulo. The incidence was 16 per 100,000, and another study in Ireland found the incidence to be about 19 per 100,000. So what is it that Bologna, Veneto, Brazil, and Ireland have in common, which we do not have in South London? What is it that protects you from psychosis? What do you think? I think it must be the Pope. It must be the Pope. So it's because Italy, Brazil, and Ireland are all Catholic countries, and we are not. But maybe the new Pope, although he is wonderful, is too early to have an effect. So it's unlikely to be him. So it is interesting, why does Italy have less psychosis and less schizophrenia than London? So Verona, Veneto, and Bologna are very wealthy areas without so many social problems. So we thought maybe we look at a larger city, and we've looked at Palermo, although it's got the beautiful Mondello Beach and a wonderful reopened theatre. It has many social problems like South London. So this is a study carried out by Alicia Mull and colleagues in Palermo. She is a PhD student of mine, so it's using the same data, the same methodology as in South London. And when Alicia uses the same methodology, she identified 204 cases of first episode psychosis over 2 years in the city of Palermo. Very careful study, going through all the different clinical units, asking all the private psychiatrists, had they seen any new cases of psychosis. And she gets an incidence of 16 per 100,000, which is almost the same as the rates in Veneto and Bologna, but very much lower than the London rates. So Palermo, Veneto, Bologna all have these lower rates, or maybe I should say normal rates of psychosis, whereas in London we have these abnormally high rates. So what could the reason be? Could it be lower migration? So in Palermo, Alicia's study, and in Bologna, Ilaria Tarracone's study, they also show that migrants have indeed higher rates. But of course, migration is less common in Bologna, and particularly in Palermo, than in London. Only 4% of the population in Palermo are first-generation migrants, against 30% in London. So if you exclude the effect of the migrants, the difference between Palermo and London greatly decreases, because the migrants with their 6 times higher rates are pushing up the incidence in London. But it doesn't abolish the difference. So maybe cannabis use could be the reason for the remaining difference. But when you ask people in Palermo, do they use cannabis? The same proportion of people in Palermo have used cannabis as have the people in South London. But hardly anybody in Palermo has used high-potency cannabis, the skunk cannabis with 16% of THC instead of 4% THC. Only 2 people had used high-potency cannabis, not in Palermo. They had gone on holiday to Amsterdam, and there they'd used high-potency cannabis. So high-potency cannabis is not important as a cause of schizophrenia in Palermo, but is responsible for 24% of new cases of psychosis in London. So this clearly contributes to the difference. So I think the majority of the difference, the high incidence in London compared with Italy, is due to the migration to the high-potency cannabis, probably also to some extent to the greater the less social cohesion which we have in London than you have in Italy. So if we think that social factors are important, such as the factors involved in migration, and yet we think that schizophrenia and psychosis result from dopamine dysregulation, can social adversity influence a dopamine function? So here we are with the synapse in the striatum, and we know that people with psychosis have increased synthesis, but in recent years it's becoming evident that the social factors that increase the incidence also increase striatal dopamine. So if you put individuals in a PET scanner and stress them, then they increase the release of dopamine. Childhood abuse, migration, amphetamines, cannabis, all increase striatal dopamine. So here, for example, is just one study, and this is a study by Alice Egerton, taking non-psychotic individuals, 67 young adults, non-psychotic, divided into those who had never experienced sexual abuse or physical abuse, and those who had experienced sexual abuse. And you can see that the individuals on the right-hand side who had experienced sexual abuse had higher striatal dopamine synthesis. So exposure to abuse in childhood dysregulates the dopamine system and causes you to have higher dopamine in adult life. So we can think that there's the developmental route to psychosis, there's the drug abuse route to psychosis, and there's also a social adversity route to psychosis, which probably operates through the HPA axis. There are these different routes, but they all end up causing dopamine dysregulation and the picture of positive symptoms of psychosis. Does this have clinical implications? Yes, it does, because you can understand why people have their onset of psychosis. So if you look at this summary slide, you can see in the top left-hand corner the effect of acute social stress on individuals who are vulnerable. You can see that the acute psychosocial stress, adverse life event, in a sensitized dopamine system results in increased dopamine release. The increased dopamine release causes the abnormal salience, which causes people to misperceive their environment. If they've had an adverse childhood, they may have a paranoid cognitive schema, therefore they interpret the abnormal perceptions in a paranoid manner, and this causes psychosis. Once they're psychotic, they are convinced that other people are going to kill them, going to harm them. They get more stressed. Therefore, their dopamine goes up further. They get more psychotic. Then their family phone one of you, and you come along to see them and say, I am afraid none of these things that you're imagining are true. I'm afraid you're psychiatrically ill. I think you need to come to our nice hospital and get some medication. They're very stressed. This causes even more stress. We all think we're helping the patients, but they think we're out to kill them or poison them. And therefore, they increase their dopamine further. Therefore, they get more psychotic. But of course, you can also break the cycle. You can break the cycle by using antipsychotics to block the D2 receptor, or you can break the cycle by altering the psychosocial environment to remove the stresses that are causing the psychosis in the first place. So at that point, I'll stop, and thank you very much for your attention.